There are moments when a single voice can change everything, when someone who seems broken becomes the hero nobody saw coming. Sometimes the person everyone dismisses as crazy is the only one telling the truth. In the mountain town of Cedar Ridge, folks gather to say goodbye to their beloved schoolteacher, Rachel Morgan. The preacher speaks softly as families hold each other close. But then a wild man bursts through the crowd, shirtless and scarred, the hermit everyone calls mad. It's Jeremiah Hawk, who lost his mind in the mines years ago. He points at the coffin and shouts, "She ain't dead. Check her pulse." Everyone thinks he's lost his mind again. The undertaker waves him off, but when they open that coffin and find the faintest heartbeat, everything changes. What secret was someone willing to bury alive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Ridge as Rachel Morgan walked the familiar path to her one-room schoolhouse, her leather-bound teaching journal tucked securely under her arm. For 23 years, she had made this same journey, watching children grow into adults, teaching 3 generations to read and write in this remote mountain town where education was both precious and rare. At 41, Rachel possessed the kind of quiet dignity that comes from a life spent in service to others. Her auburn hair now touched with silver threads that caught the early light. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town like a beacon of hope, its white-painted walls and bell tower representing everything the community valued most. Inside those walls, Rachel had witnessed countless small miracles. The moment a struggling child finally grasped the meaning of letters on a page. The proud smile of a parent watching their offspring recite poetry. The careful penmanship of love letters written by young people she had taught to hold a pencil properly. Her teaching journal held more than lesson plans. Between its worn leather covers lay the documented history of Cedar Ridge itself, recorded through the eyes of its children. Birth announcements, family migrations, crop failures, mining accidents, marriages and deaths, all filtered through the innocent observations of young minds who trusted their teacher with their deepest thoughts and fears. Rachel understood that in a town of 300 souls, the schoolteacher wasn't just an educator. She was a keeper of stories, a guardian of memory, a witness to the slow passage of time in a place where change came as gradually as the seasons. The town itself had grown around the school like rings in a tree trunk. Main Street stretched for 6 blocks, lined with modest businesses that served the surrounding farming and mining community. Henderson's General Store occupied the largest building, its wooden porch always crowded with men discussing weather and politics while their wives selected fabric and supplies. The church stood across from the schoolhouse, its simple spire reaching toward heaven with the same humble aspiration as its congregation. Dr. Samuel Morrison's office sat next to the church, and beyond that, the undertaker's establishment, a business that stayed busy in a place where life was hard and medical care limited. Jeremiah Hawk's story began 15 years earlier, when he was simply Jerry, the most respected mine foreman in the territory. Back then, he had been clean-shaven and clear-eyed, a man whose knowledge of underground geology and worker safety had made him indispensable to the Mountain View Mining Company. He understood rock formations the way some men understood horses or cattle, reading the subtle signs that warned of cave-ins or gas pockets. His crews trusted him completely, knowing that Jerry Hawk would never send them into danger he wouldn't face himself. The accident that changed everything happened on a Tuesday morning in October, when Jerry led a team deep into the mountain to investigate reports of a promising new copper vein. The explosion came without warning, a massive blast that collapsed half a mile of tunnels and trapped 23 men underground for 4 days. When the rescue teams finally broke through, they found Jerry cradling the bodies of 2 young miners, his mind shattered by the weight of responsibility and survivor's guilt. The official report blamed a gas pocket and faulty equipment, but Jerry knew something else had caused that explosion. He had seen the telltale signs of deliberate sabotage, the careful placement of charges designed to look accidental. But when Jerry tried to tell his story, the words came out wrong. The trauma had damaged something fundamental in his ability to communicate, leaving him with fragments of thoughts that never quite connected into coherent sentences. The mine company declared him mentally unfit and offered a small pension, which he refused. Instead, he walked away from civilization entirely, disappearing into the mountain wilderness like a ghost returning to haunt the scene of his downfall. For 15 years, Jeremiah Hawk had lived alone in a cabin he built with his own hands, high on the mountainside where the air was thin and the silence absolute. He survived by trapping, hunting, and trading pelts for the few supplies he couldn't make or forage himself. The townspeople occasionally glimpsed him during his rare visits to Henderson's store, a wild-haired figure in patched clothing who moved through the aisles like a nervous animal, never making eye contact, never speaking unless absolutely necessary. Children created legends about the mad hermit who lived in the mountains. Some said he could talk to bears and wolves. Others claimed he had survived the mine explosion by making a deal with the devil. Parents used him as a cautionary tale. Behave yourself, or the crazy mountain man might steal you away. Only Rachel had ever shown him kindness during those brief encounters, offering a gentle nod or a quiet "good morning, Jerry," that acknowledged the man he used to be rather than the broken creature he had become. The mysterious illness that nearly claimed Rachel's life began 3 weeks before the funeral, starting with headaches and dizzy spells that she attributed to the approaching winter weather. Dr. Morrison prescribed rest and herbal tea, assuring her that many folks in town were suffering from similar symptoms. But Rachel's condition deteriorated rapidly, progressing to violent nausea, difficulty breathing, and periods of unconsciousness that left her feeling disconnected from her own body. During her final week, Rachel experienced strange gaps in her memory, hours that seemed to vanish completely, leaving her confused and disoriented. She would find herself in locations with no recollection of how she had arrived there, discover half-written lessons in her journal that she couldn't remember composing, or wake up fully dressed at odd hours with dirt under her fingernails and the taste of something bitter on her tongue. Dr. Morrison made house calls twice daily during Rachel's final decline, his medical bag always at hand as he administered what he claimed were pain medications and vital tonics. His manner grew increasingly nervous as Rachel's condition worsened, his hands shaking as he prepared her doses and his eyes avoiding direct contact when she tried to ask questions about her symptoms. On the morning they found Rachel apparently lifeless in her bed, Dr. Morrison pronounced her dead from what he termed mountain fever, a vague diagnosis that satisfied no one but went unchallenged in a community that trusted their doctor's expertise. The town's grief was profound and genuine. Rachel had touched every family in Cedar Ridge, and her sudden death felt like losing the community's heart. Mothers wept openly as they remembered the patient hours she had spent with their struggling children. Fathers spoke quietly of the respect she had earned through 2 decades of dedicated service. Even the most practical residents admitted that Rachel Morgan had been irreplaceable, and her death left a void that could never be filled. The funeral preparations brought the entire community together in a shared expression of love and loss. Women from the church auxiliary spent 3 days cooking enough food to feed everyone who would attend the service. Men volunteered their time to build a proper coffin from the finest pine lumber available, crafting it with the same care they would have shown for their own family members. The undertaker, Marcus Bellwether, had worked through the night to prepare Rachel's body with unusual attention to detail, taking extra care with her appearance because he knew the entire town would want to pay their respects. Children who had been Rachel's students gathered wildflowers from the mountainsides, creating bouquets that filled the church with the sweet fragrance of late autumn blooms. The older students composed a poem in her honor, working together to find words that might capture what their beloved teacher had meant to them. Even the youngest children understood that something precious had been lost. Though they couldn't fully comprehend the finality of death, As the funeral procession made its way to the cemetery, the entire population of Cedar Ridge walked together in respectful silence. The pine coffin, carried by 6 of Rachel's former students who had grown into strong young men, seemed to symbolize not just the loss of one woman, but the fragility of life itself in this harsh mountain environment. Behind the coffin walked Dr. Morrison, his face pale and drawn with what everyone assumed was grief, but might have been something else entirely. The cemetery occupied a peaceful hillside overlooking the town, where modest headstones marked the resting places of Cedar Ridge's departed souls. Rachel's grave had been dug that morning, the dark earth piled neatly beside the rectangular opening that awaited her final rest. The preacher, Reverend Thomas, had prepared special remarks celebrating Rachel's life and her contributions to the community. Words he hoped might provide comfort to the mourners who would struggle to imagine their town without her guiding presence. High on the mountainside, in the cabin built from hand-hewn logs and chinked with mountain clay, Jeremiah Hawke had watched the funeral preparations through an old telescope he had salvaged from the mine office years before. Something about the proceedings troubled him deeply, though he couldn't articulate exactly what felt wrong. Perhaps it was the way Dr. Morrison kept checking his pocket watch, or the unusual haste with which the coffin had been sealed, or simply the instinct of a man who had spent 15 years learning to read the subtle signs that others missed. As the mourners gathered around Rachel's grave, Jeremiah made a decision that would change everything. He set down his telescope, pulled on his boots, and began the long descent toward town, driven by a certainty he couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. Something was terribly wrong, and he was the only one who could see it. The chaos that erupted after Jeremiah's dramatic interruption of the funeral would be talked about in Cedar Ridge for generations to come. As willing hands carefully lifted Rachel's unconscious form from the pine coffin, her skin held the waxy pallor of near death, but the faintest warmth still lingered in her flesh. Dr. Morrison's trembling fingers found the pulse that Jeremiah had insisted was there, weak and irregular, but undeniably present. "Get her to my office immediately," Dr. Morrison commanded, his voice cracking with what sounded like panic rather than professional urgency. Several men lifted Rachel gently, her head lolling against one man's shoulder as they carried her toward town with unprecedented haste. The crowd followed in stunned silence, their grief transformed into confusion and growing suspicion. Inside his medical office, Dr. Morrison worked frantically to revive his patient, administering stimulants and forcing warm broth between her pale lips. His hands shook as he prepared each treatment, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. When Rachel's eyelids finally fluttered open 3 hours later, her first words were barely audible. "What happened to me?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Dr. Morrison claimed she had suffered from a rare condition that mimicked death, something he had read about in medical journals but never encountered personally. His explanation satisfied some of the townspeople, but others noticed how his eyes avoided direct contact and how his voice wavered when he spoke. More troubling was the small glass vial that fell from his medical bag during the commotion. A container he quickly retrieved and tucked away before anyone could examine its contents. Jeremiah remained at the edge of the crowd, his wild appearance drawing fearful glances and whispered conversations. When Sheriff Wade Preston approached him for questioning, Jeremiah struggled to explain how he had known Rachel was alive. His words came in fragments, disconnected thoughts that painted him as either remarkably intuitive or completely delusional. "Watched." "From the mountain," Jeremiah muttered, his scarred hands gesturing toward the peaks above town. "Something wrong." The way she lay, breathing, shallow breathing, saw it through the glass. He pulled out an old telescope, its brass fittings green with age. Always watching, always seeing what others miss. Sheriff Preston, a practical man in his 50s who had maintained law and order in Cedar Ridge for over a decade, found himself caught between skepticism and grudging respect. Jeremiah's claim about watching the funeral from the mountainside was plausible. The hermit was known to observe the town from a distance, but his insistence that he could detect breathing from such a range seemed impossible, even with optical assistance. "You're saying you saw her breathing in the coffin from up on the mountain?" Preston asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Not breathing strong, just barely. Like a bird with a broken wing. Had to come down, had to stop them from putting her in the ground." Jeremiah's eyes held a clarity that contrasted sharply with his disheveled appearance. 15 years I've been watching this town, Sheriff. 15 years of seeing things that don't add up right. As Rachel slowly regained consciousness in Dr. Morrison's office, fragments of memory began returning to her like pieces of a shattered mirror. She remembered feeling increasingly ill over the past weeks, but there were gaps, entire hours that seemed to have vanished from her recollection. She recalled Dr. Morrison's visits, the bitter taste of his medicines, and a growing sense of disconnection from her own body. "Doctor," she whispered when he leaned over her examination table, "what kind of illness causes someone to appear dead?" "I've never heard of such a condition." Dr. Morrison's explanation came in nervous rushes of medical terminology that seemed designed more to confuse than to clarify. He spoke of rare toxins, unusual reactions to natural compounds, and the delicate balance between life and death in cases of severe poisoning. But when Rachel asked direct questions about her treatment, his answers became evasive. The townspeople gathered outside the doctor's office, their conversations growing more heated as the afternoon progressed. Some praised Jeremiah as a hero who had saved their beloved teacher's life. Others remained convinced that he was simply a madman who had gotten lucky with a wild guess. The division reflected deeper tensions within the community, between those who trusted established authority and those who had always harbored doubts about the official explanations for various local mysteries. Mrs. Catherine Winters, whose children had been among Rachel's favorite students, spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "That man may be touched in the head, but he saved Miss Rachel's life. Seems to me we owe him more respect than we've been showing all these years." But Marcus Bellwether, the undertaker, felt his professional reputation had been damaged by the day's events. "I've been preparing bodies for 20 years, he declared defensively. "I know death when I see it. That woman showed no signs of life when they brought her to me." The argument might have continued indefinitely if not for a discovery that shifted everyone's attention. Young Timothy Brooks, one of Rachel's former students who had helped carry her from the coffin, found something troubling when he returned to retrieve his jacket from the cemetery. Hidden beneath a pile of fresh-turned earth near Rachel's intended grave lay a small glass vial, similar to the one that had fallen from Dr. Morrison's bag. Timothy brought the vial to Sheriff Preston, who examined it carefully in the fading afternoon light. The container held traces of a clear liquid and bore no identifying marks, but its placement seemed deliberately concealed rather than accidentally dropped. When Preston questioned Dr. Morrison about the vial, the doctor's response was unconvincing. He claimed to have no knowledge of how it had gotten there. The discovery prompted Sheriff Preston to conduct a more thorough investigation of Rachel's mysterious illness. He interviewed several townspeople who had visited her during her final weeks, and their accounts revealed disturbing inconsistencies. Some mentioned seeing Dr. Morrison leaving Rachel's cabin at odd hours, often carrying his medical bag and appearing unusually furtive. Others recalled that Rachel had seemed confused and disoriented during conversations, as if she were struggling to maintain focus. Most troubling were the reports of Rachel's strange behavior during her final days. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, who lived next door to the schoolhouse, described seeing Rachel wandering around her property late at night, moving like someone who wasn't fully conscious. "She walked like she was sleepwalking," Mrs. Hayes told the sheriff. "When I called out to her, she didn't seem to hear me. Just kept moving around like she was looking for something, but didn't know what." Jeremiah, meanwhile, had retreated to the edge of town, but hadn't returned to his mountain cabin. Something kept him near Cedar Ridge, a nagging certainty that Rachel's ordeal wasn't finished. He understood from his years of living close to nature that certain plants growing in the high mountain regions could produce effects similar to what Rachel had experienced. The indigenous peoples had known about these properties for generations, using them in carefully controlled doses for ceremonial purposes. When Sheriff Preston finally sought out Jeremiah for a more detailed conversation, he found the hermit sitting on a fallen log near the town's outskirts, staring thoughtfully at the mountains. Jeremiah's appearance remained wild and unkempt, but his manner seemed calmer, more focused than it had been during the chaotic funeral scene. "You mentioned seeing things that don't add up," Preston said, settling himself on another log nearby. "What kind of things?" Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment, organizing his thoughts with visible effort. Strangers in the mountains. Men who don't belong. Surveying equipment where there shouldn't be any. Questions asked about land ownership, mineral rights. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, the words coming more easily. "Something's been building toward this, Sheriff. Miss Rachel's poisoning, and that's what it was. Poisoning, it's just the beginning." The sheriff leaned forward, his interest sharpened by Jeremiah's unexpected coherence. "Poisoning? What makes you so certain?" "The plant that did this to her. It grows in the high meadows where the copper veins run closest to the surface. The old-timers knew about it, used it to settle land disputes sometimes. Make someone appear dead, bury them, problem solved." Jeremiah's eyes held a haunted quality as he continued. "I've seen it used before, Sheriff. 15 years ago, right before the mine explosion that destroyed my life, as the sun set over Cedar Ridge, casting long shadows across the town where everyone's certainties had been shattered in a single afternoon. The residents faced an uncomfortable truth. Their quiet mountain community had been harboring secrets, and the mad hermit they had dismissed and feared might be the only one who understood the real danger they faced. Rachel's near burial had been just the first move in a larger game, and someone was willing to kill, to keep their plans hidden. The poison bottle, found near the gravesite, represented more than attempted murder. It was evidence of a conspiracy that threatened everything the people of Cedar Ridge held dear. 3 days after her miraculous resurrection, Rachel sat at her kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea growing cold in her hands, struggling to piece together the fragments of memory that drifted through her mind like autumn leaves caught in an uncertain wind. Her small cabin behind the schoolhouse felt both familiar and foreign, as if she was seeing it through someone else's eyes. The missing time haunted her, entire days that had vanished from her recollection, leaving only disconnected images and the persistent taste of something bitter that no amount of tea could wash away. The symptoms, she remembered, were unlike anything in her experience of common illnesses. The headaches had felt different from the usual tension she experienced after long days of teaching. These had been accompanied by a strange disconnection from her own thoughts, as if her mind were wrapped in cotton wool. During those final weeks, simple tasks had become monumental efforts. Writing lesson plans had taken hours instead of minutes, and she had found herself staring at her own handwriting without recognizing the words she had written. Most disturbing were the gaps in her memory. Rachel distinctly remembered going to bed on a Tuesday evening, but her next clear recollection was waking up on Thursday afternoon with dirt under her fingernails and pine needles in her hair. When she had tried to ask Dr. Morrison about these episodes during his visits, he had dismissed her concerns as normal confusion associated with her illness. Now, sitting in her kitchen with her mind gradually clearing, those dismissals seemed less like medical reassurance and more like deliberate misdirection. A gentle knock at her door interrupted her troubled thoughts. She opened it to find Jeremiah Hawk standing on her porch, his wild appearance somewhat subdued by genuine concern. He held his battered hat in his hands and shifted nervously from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable with the social interaction, but determined to see it through. "Miss Rachel," he said, his voice softer than it had been during the chaotic funeral scene. "Wanted to check on you. See how you're mending." Rachel studied his face, seeing past the unkempt beard and sun-weathered skin to the intelligence in his eyes. This close, she could see the scars that marked his hands and forearms, evidence of his years working in dangerous conditions. More importantly, she could see the compassion that had driven him to risk public humiliation to save her life. "Please come in," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "I believe I owe you more thanks than I can properly express." Jeremiah entered hesitantly, his eyes taking in the neat domesticity of her home. Books lined the shelves, student papers were stacked on a side table, and dried herbs hung from the kitchen rafters, evidence of a life dedicated to learning and nurturing others. It had been 15 years since he'd been inside a proper home, and the warmth of the space seemed to overwhelm him. "No thanks needed," he mumbled, still clutching his hat. "Just did what anyone should have done, but you were the only one who did it," Rachel replied gently. "Everyone else accepted what they were told. You trusted what you saw with your own eyes." She poured him a cup of tea and gestured toward a chair. "That takes courage, especially for someone who—" She paused, searching for tactful words. "Someone who's been branded a madman?" Jeremiah finished with a bitter smile. 15 years of living alone gives a man plenty of time to think, Miss Rachel. Maybe too much time. But it also teaches you to see things clearly, without all the noise that comes from other people's expectations." As they talked, Rachel found herself remembering fragments of their brief acquaintance from before his transformation. Jerry Hawk had been respected throughout the territory for his mining expertise and his genuine concern for worker safety. She recalled attending a community meeting where he had spoken passionately about improving conditions in the mines, his voice carrying the authority of someone who truly understood the dangers faced by working men. "You used to come to the school sometimes," she said softly. "Before the accident. You would talk to the older boys about geology, show them rock samples." Jeremiah's expression grew pained. "Different man then. Had a future, had plans." He stared into his teacup. "Thought I might even work up the courage to ask a certain school teacher to accompany me to the harvest dance." The admission hung between them, a glimpse of the path not taken that made Rachel's heart ache for what had been lost. She reached across the table and touched his scarred hand gently. "That man is still there, Jerry. I can see him." Their conversation was interrupted by Sheriff Preston's arrival, his heavy footsteps on the porch announcing his presence before he knocked. Rachel admitted him readily, grateful for his thorough investigation of her near-death experience. Preston's weathered face showed the strain of recent events, and his usual confident demeanor seemed shaken by discoveries that challenged everything he thought he knew about his peaceful town. "Miss Rachel, I'm glad to see you looking stronger," Preston said, removing his hat respectfully. He nodded to Jeremiah with newfound respect. "Mr. Hawk, I was hoping to find you here. We need to discuss what you told me about plants and their effects." Jeremiah straightened in his chair, his fragmented thoughts focusing with visible effort. "The bitter root that grows in the high meadows," he said. "Indians called it false death, used it in tiny amounts for vision quests, but a larger dose," he shook his head grimly, "makes a person appear dead for hours, sometimes days. And you've seen this used before?" Preston asked. 15 years ago, right before the mine explosion. Found one of the surveyors acting strange, like he was sleepwalking. Next day he was found dead in his tent. Company buried him quick, said it was his heart. Jeremiah's voice grew stronger as the memories crystallized. "But I saw him walking around 3 days later, far from town, talking to men I didn't recognize." Rachel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Someone wanted to fake that man's death? But why?" "Same reason someone wanted to fake yours," Jeremiah replied. "To remove an obstacle. That surveyor had been asking too many questions about mineral rights, about who really owned the land under the town." Sheriff Preston leaned forward intently. "What kind of questions?" "Questions about the original land grants, about whether the mining company had legal right to expand their operations. Questions that might have prevented a lot of people from getting very rich." Jeremiah's eyes met Rachel's. "Same kind of questions a smart schoolteacher might ask if she noticed the wrong people sniffing." Around her town, the pieces began forming a pattern that made Rachel's blood run cold. She excused herself and walked to the schoolhouse, her mind racing as she considered what Jeremiah had suggested. If someone had wanted her out of the way, there had to be a reason, something she knew or had access to that posed a threat to their plans. Inside the familiar walls of her classroom, Rachel went directly to her desk and began searching through the papers and documents she had accumulated over 2 decades of teaching. Her fingers found the hidden compartment she had installed years earlier to protect important school records, and she pulled out a stack of yellowed papers that made her gasp with sudden understanding. The mining company documents had been stored in her desk for safekeeping when the company office had closed 5 years earlier. As the unofficial keeper of town records, Rachel had been entrusted with various legal papers that might someday prove important. Among them were detailed surveys of mineral deposits throughout the region, land acquisition contracts, and correspondence about expansion plans that would transform the entire valley. One document in particular caught her attention, a letter dated just 6 months earlier, discussing plans to purchase all private property in Cedar Ridge for a massive open-pit mining operation. The letterhead bore the name of a company she didn't recognize, but the scope of their ambitions was breathtaking. They intended to relocate the entire town, strip mine the valley, and extract copper ore worth millions of dollars. The final paragraph of the letter made her hands tremble. The schoolteacher remains the primary obstacle to our land acquisition plans. Her position as unofficial record keeper and her influence with local families make it essential that she be neutralized before we proceed. Dr. Morrison has agreed to assist with this matter in exchange for his gambling debts being forgiven. Rachel sank into her chair, the full scope of the conspiracy becoming clear. Her near death had been deliberate, planned and executed by people she had trusted. More terrifying was the realization that her survival meant they would likely try again, and next time they might not rely on such an uncertain method. She gathered the documents quickly and hurried back to her cabin, where Jeremiah and Sheriff Preston waited with growing concern. When she showed them what she had discovered, the silence in the room was heavy with the weight of betrayal and danger. "We have to get these documents to the territorial capital," Preston said finally. "This is bigger than anything we can handle locally." "They'll kill her before we can get word out," Jeremiah said quietly. "And they'll kill anyone who tries to help her." He looked directly at Rachel, his eyes holding a determination she hadn't seen in them before. "You saved my life once, Miss Rachel, by treating me like a human being when everyone else saw only a madman. Now it's my turn to save yours." The mining company documents represented more than evidence of conspiracy. They were a death warrant for anyone who possessed them. But they were also the key to saving Cedar Ridge from destruction if they could survive long enough to use them. The weight of Jeremiah's dented mining helmet in his scarred hands brought back memories that cut through his consciousness like shards of broken glass. Sitting alone in Rachel's kitchen while she and Sheriff Preston made plans to secure the incriminating documents, Jeremiah found himself transported back to that terrible October morning 15 years ago when his world had collapsed along with half a mile of mountain tunnels. The helmet had been his father's before him, passed down through 2 generations of miners who had worked these mountains when copper was king and safety regulations were suggestions rather than laws. The metal bore the scars of countless impacts, falling rocks, low-hanging timbers, and the final explosion that had left Jeremiah himself scarred in ways that went far deeper than the physical marks on his body. That morning in 1878, Jeremiah had been leading a survey team deep into the mountain to investigate what the company geologists claimed was a promising new copper vein. But Jeremiah's experienced eye had read the rock formations differently. The area they were being sent to explore showed clear signs of instability, fractured granite, unusual seepage patterns, and the kind of pressure changes that warned of dangerous gas pockets. When he had tried to voice his concerns to the company supervisors, they had dismissed his caution as excessive worry. The Eastern investors were pressuring for results, they explained, and every day of delay cost money that none of them could afford to lose. Jeremiah had been given a direct order: survey the new section or find new employment. The explosion had come without the usual warning signs that experienced miners learned to recognize. Instead of the gradual creaking and settling that preceded most cave-ins, there had been a sudden, massive blast that spoke of deliberately placed charges rather than natural geological failure. Jeremiah had thrown himself over two young miners, using his own body to shield them from falling debris. But the concussive force had damaged something fundamental in his brain, not just his ability to speak coherently, but his capacity to trust the world around him. In the aftermath, as rescue teams worked frantically to dig out the survivors, Jeremiah had tried to tell them about the evidence he had seen. The blast patterns were wrong for a gas explosion. The timing was too convenient, coming just days after he had filed his safety concerns with the Territorial Mining Authority. Most damning of all, he had glimpsed unfamiliar faces among the rescue workers, men who seemed more interested in collecting specific pieces of debris than in saving lives. But trauma had stolen his ability to communicate these crucial observations effectively. The words that came out of his mouth were fragments, disconnected thoughts that made him sound delusional rather than credible. The company's official investigation concluded that Jeremiah's mental state made him an unreliable witness, and his testimony was quietly dismissed as the ravings of a man broken by tragedy. Now, holding that same helmet while Rachel's life hung in the balance, Jeremiah felt the familiar rage building in his chest, not the wild, unfocused anger that had driven him into the mountains, but a cold, purposeful fury directed at the people who had stolen so much from so many. The patterns were repeating themselves: false deaths, buried evidence, and innocent lives sacrificed for corporate profits. Rachel's voice brought him back to the present moment. She had returned from the schoolhouse with Sheriff Preston, both of them carrying additional documents that painted an even more disturbing picture of the conspiracy surrounding her attempted murder. The mining company's plans were more extensive than they had initially realized, involving not just Cedar Ridge, but several other mountain communities that sat atop valuable mineral deposits. "Jerry," Rachel said gently, using the name from his former life, "Sheriff Preston says you mentioned seeing strangers in the mountains recently. Can you tell us more about that?" Jeremiah set down his helmet and focused on organizing his thoughts, a process that had become easier since his mind had begun clearing in response to having a concrete purpose. 3 weeks ago, maybe 4, saw surveying equipment being carried up the North Ridge. Professional gear, not the kind local prospectors use. His voice grew steadier as he continued. Men with it weren't from around here. City clothes, soft hands. But they knew exactly where they were going. What were they surveying? Preston asked. Property lines, water rights, looking for the best places to put roads and equipment if someone wanted to strip mine the whole valley. Jeremiah's expression darkened. They were mapping out how to destroy everything we've built here. Rachel spread the mining company documents across her kitchen table, pointing to specific passages that corroborated Jeremiah's observations. Look at this letter dated 3 months ago. They've been planning this operation for at least a year, maybe longer. They already have buyers lined up for the copper ore, and they've calculated that relocating the entire population of Cedar Ridge will cost less than negotiating. Fair prices for individual properties. The documents revealed a level of cold calculation that chilled all 3 of them. The mining company had studied every aspect of the community: population numbers, property values, local political structures, and potential sources of resistance. Rachel's name appeared multiple times in their correspondence, always in the context of being the primary obstacle to their land acquisition plans. "They know about your influence with the families here," Preston observed. 23 years of teaching their children has made you the most trusted person in town. If you recommended they refuse to sell, most of them would listen. And if I were dead," Rachel said quietly, There would be no one left with the education and authority to challenge their legal claims. Jeremiah stood and walked to the window, his eyes scanning the mountains with the practiced gaze of someone who had learned to read danger in the landscape. "They're still out there," he said, watching, waiting to see if their plan worked. When they realized it didn't, he turned back to Rachel and Preston. "They'll try something more direct next time." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Through the window, they could see Dr. Morrison riding toward the cabin, his medical bag secured behind his saddle and his face showing the strain of a man carrying terrible secrets. Behind him rode two men that none of them recognized, well-dressed strangers whose presence in Cedar Ridge could only mean trouble. "We need to leave," Jeremiah said urgently. "Now, before they reach the house." But Rachel shook her head, her jaw set with determination. "Running won't solve anything. These documents are the proof we need, but only if we can get them to people who have the authority to act on them." She gathered the papers quickly, stuffing them into her teaching satchel. "We need to stay and face this, but we need to be smart about it." Sheriff Preston checked his sidearm and positioned himself near the front door. "I'll handle Dr. Morrison and his friends. You two get out the back and head for the schoolhouse. If things go wrong, at least you'll have those documents safe." "No," Jeremiah said firmly. "We stay together. 15 years ago, I let them isolate me, make me look crazy so no one would believe my testimony. This time, we present a united front." He picked up his mining helmet and settled it on his head, the familiar weight somehow restoring his confidence. "Besides, I know things about this mountain that those city boys never learned. If we need to disappear, I can make that happen." The horses drew closer, and through the window they could see Dr. Morrison's nervous expressions as he spoke with his companions. Whatever instructions he had been given, it was clear that he was reluctant to carry them out. But the two strangers showed no such hesitation. Their postures and the way they wore their weapons suggested men accustomed to using violence to solve problems. Rachel moved to stand beside Jeremiah, her hand briefly touching his scarred fingers in a gesture of solidarity that spoke louder than words. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "I want you to know that you've already saved more than just my life. You've given me back my faith in what one person can do when they refuse to accept injustice." The mining helmet that had once symbolized Jeremiah's shattered past now represented something different, a connection to his expertise, his courage, and his determination to prevent others from suffering the losses he had endured. As Dr. Morrison and his companions dismounted outside Rachel's cabin, Jeremiah felt the scattered pieces of his identity beginning to coalesce around a single, crystal-clear purpose, protecting the woman who had shown him kindness when the rest of the world saw only madness, and protecting the community that had been his home before trauma drove him into exile. The confrontation that was about to unfold would test everything they had learned about trust, courage, and the power of truth to overcome even the most carefully constructed lies. The discovery of the wooden survey stakes scattered throughout Cedar Ridge's property lines came at dawn, when young Timothy Brooks was making his morning rounds to check on the livestock. The stakes were professionally made, marked with cryptic numbers and symbols that meant nothing to the local residents, but everything to the surveyors who had placed them. Each stake had been driven deep into the ground with precision, marking boundaries and elevations with the kind of accuracy that spoke of serious commercial intentions. Timothy brought the first stake to Sheriff Preston, who examined the markings with growing concern. The numbers corresponded to a grid system that divided the entire valley into manageable sections for industrial development. More disturbing were the elevation markers that indicated someone had been calculating optimal locations for heavy machinery and transportation infrastructure. "They've been planning this down to the foot," Preston told Rachel and Jeremiah as they gathered in his office to examine the evidence. "Every building in town, every farm, every pasture, They've mapped it all for destruction. Jeremiah studied the stake with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years reading survey markers in mining operations. These aren't recent, he said, running his fingers along the weathered wood. Look at the grain pattern, the way the metal fittings have oxidized. These have been in the ground for months, maybe longer. The implications hit Rachel like a physical blow. They've been planning my murder for months. Watching me, studying my routines, waiting for the right moment to eliminate the obstacle I represented. She sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the calculated nature of the conspiracy. How many other people are they planning to kill? Their investigation was interrupted by a commotion outside the sheriff's office. Through the windows, they could see Dr. Morrison approaching with deliberate steps, his medical bag clutched tightly in his white-knuckled hands. Behind him walked the two strangers who had accompanied him to Rachel's cabin the previous evening, their city clothes and confident bearing marking them as dangerous outsiders in this close-knit mountain community. Sheriff Preston stepped outside to meet them, his hand resting casually on his gun belt in a gesture that was both professional and threatening. "Dr. Morrison," he said formally, "I wasn't expecting to see you so early this morning." Dr. Morrison's face was pale and drawn, his usual composed demeanor replaced by obvious distress. "Sheriff, I need to speak with you about Miss Rachel's condition. There have been developments that require immediate attention." "What kind of developments?" Preston asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. One of the strangers stepped forward, a tall man with cold eyes and expensive boots that had never seen honest work. "Sheriff Preston, I'm Harold Blackstone, representing the Mountain Development Corporation. We understand there's been some confusion about Miss Morgan's recent medical emergency, and we're here to help clarify the situation." "I don't recall asking for clarification from any development corporation," Preston replied evenly. "Miss Morgan's medical emergency is a local matter, and we're handling it just fine." Blackstone's smile was as cold as winter moonlight. "I'm afraid it's not quite that simple. Sheriff, Dr. Morrison has been consulting with specialists about Miss Morgan's condition, and they've determined that she's suffering from a degenerative brain disorder that makes her increasingly unstable and dangerous. For the safety of the community, she needs to be relocated to a specialized facility where she can receive proper care." Inside the sheriff's office, Rachel felt her blood turn to ice as she listened to the conversation through the open window. The lie was so smoothly delivered, so professionally constructed, that she could see how it might convince people who didn't know the truth. A respected doctor confirming a diagnosis of mental instability would effectively discredit anything she might say about the mining conspiracy. Jeremiah moved to stand beside her, his scarred hands clenched into fists. "They're trying to do to you what they did to me," he said quietly. "Make you look crazy, so no one will believe your testimony." "The difference is," Rachel replied with growing determination, "I have evidence they can't explain away." She clutched her teaching satchel, where the incriminating documents were safely hidden. "And I have you to corroborate my story. A madman's testimony won't carry much weight," Jeremiah said bitterly. "You're not mad," Rachel said firmly. "Traumatized, yes. Damaged by what they did to you, certainly. But not mad. And people are starting to see that." Outside, Sheriff Preston was standing his ground against increasing pressure from Blackstone and his companion. "Even if Dr. Morrison's diagnosis is accurate," he said, "Miss Morgan would need to consent to any medical treatment. She's conscious, coherent, and capable of making her own decisions." "Actually," Dr. Morrison interjected nervously, "the specialists believe her condition has progressed to the point where she's no longer competent to make informed decisions about her care. The episodes of apparent death are symptoms of severe neurological deterioration that will only worsen without immediate intervention." Blackstone nodded gravely. "We have legal authority to take her into protective custody for her own safety and the safety of others. The Territorial Medical Board has reviewed her case and granted us emergency powers." The legal documents that Blackstone produced looked official and intimidating. complete with territorial seals and impressive signatures. But Rachel recognized the tactic, overwhelming local authorities with paperwork, and claimed expertise to circumvent normal legal protections. It was the same approach the mining company had used 15 years earlier to silence Jeremiah's testimony about the explosion. "We need to get out of here," Jeremiah said urgently. Now, while they're focused on the sheriff, but Rachel shook her head. "Running will only confirm their story that I'm mentally unstable. We need to confront this head-on." She gathered the mining documents and stepped outside, her chin raised with the quiet dignity that had made her such an effective teacher. "Gentlemen," she said calmly, "I understand there's some concern about my mental state. I'd like to address those concerns directly." Dr. Morrison flinched as if he'd been struck, his guilt written clearly across his features. Blackstone, however, maintained his professional composure. "Miss Morgan, we're here to help you. You've been through a terrible ordeal, and it's understandable that you might feel confused or frightened." "I'm neither confused nor frightened," Rachel replied. "I'm angry. Angry that people I trusted tried to murder me, and angry that they're now trying to gaslight me into questioning my own sanity." She pulled out the mining documents and held them where everyone could see them. "But mostly I'm angry that they think I'm stupid enough to fall for this charade." The effect of the documents on Blackstone was immediate and telling. His professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of panic before he regained control. "I'm not sure what papers you think you have there, Miss Morgan, but in your current state, you might be misinterpreting perfectly innocent business correspondence. Business correspondence about relocating the entire population of Cedar Ridge to make way for strip mining?" Rachel asked sweetly. "Business correspondence about forgiving Dr. Morrison's gambling debts in exchange for his assistance in my murder." "That kind of innocent business correspondence?" Dr. Morrison made a sound like a wounded animal and took a step backward. "Rachel, I never meant for it to go this far. They said the plant extract would just make you sick enough to miss the land survey meetings. They said you'd recover completely, Samuel," Blackstone warned sharply. "But the damage was done. I couldn't let them kill you," Dr. Morrison continued, his words tumbling out in a rush of confession. "So I used a lighter dose than they wanted, just enough to make you appear dead temporarily. I thought if you were buried and then dug up later, it would look like a miracle and no one would suspect." "Shut up, you fool," Blackstone's companion snarled, his hand moving toward the weapon concealed beneath his coat. But Jeremiah was already moving, 15 years of mountain living having honed his reflexes to a razor's edge. He tackled the gunman before the weapon could clear its holster, and the two men went down in a tangle of limbs and curses. Sheriff Preston drew his own gun and pointed it at Blackstone, who raised his hands with obvious reluctance, as I think, Preston said with grim satisfaction. "We need to have a much longer conversation about your business in Cedar Ridge, and this time we're going to do it in my jail cell while we wait for the territorial marshal to arrive." The survey stakes scattered throughout the town represented more than evidence of corporate planning. They were markers of a community's determination to resist those who would destroy their home for profit. As Rachel watched Jeremiah subdue the hired gunman with the same protective instinct he had shown during the mine explosion, she understood that their fight was just beginning. But for the first time since waking up in that coffin, she felt confident that they might actually win. The search for legal documents proving Cedar Ridge's collective ownership of mineral rights began in earnest once Blackstone and his accomplice were secured in Sheriff Preston's jail cell. Rachel led the investigation with the methodical thoroughness that had made her such an effective teacher, organizing the townspeople into search teams and dividing the most likely locations among willing volunteers. The schoolhouse basement yielded old student records and teaching supplies, but nothing related to the town's founding legal documents. Henderson's general store proved more promising, as the proprietor had inherited boxes of papers from previous business owners, including some correspondence with territorial authorities from the 1860s. But the most intriguing discovery came from Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, who remembered her late husband mentioning a hidden compartment in the schoolhouse foundation. Samuel always said the original schoolmaster was a careful man who believed in protecting important papers, she told Rachel as they examined the stone foundation with renewed interest. He built hiding places into the very bones of the building, spaces that would survive fire or flood or whatever troubles might come. Jeremiah's knowledge of construction techniques from his mining days proved invaluable in the search. He understood how builders of that era had created concealed spaces, using double walls and false foundations to hide valuables from thieves or hostile forces. His fingers traced the mortar lines with expert precision, feeling for irregularities that might indicate hidden chambers. "Here," he said finally, pressing against a section of stone that seemed identical to the rest of the foundation. The mortar's different, newer than the surrounding work, but still old enough to have been done decades ago. Working together, they carefully removed the stones to reveal a small chamber lined with oiled cloth. Inside lay a leather portfolio that had been protected from moisture and decay by the careful wrapping. Rachel's hands trembled as she opened the portfolio and found the deed of trust that would change everything. The document, dated 1862 and signed by Territorial Governor James Doty, established Cedar Ridge as a collective settlement with shared ownership of all mineral rights within a radius of 5 miles from the schoolhouse. The original founders had been survivors of various mining disasters who wanted to create a community where no single corporation could control their destiny. The deed specified that any mining operations would require unanimous consent from all adult residents, effectively giving the community veto power over their own destruction. "This is it," Rachel breathed, reading the legal language with growing excitement. "This proves that the Mountain Development Corporation has no right to take our land. They would need permission from every single person in town, and they can't get that through murder and intimidation." Jeremiah studied the deed with the same careful attention he had once given to mining surveys. "It's more than just protection," he realized. "Look at this clause here. Any mining company that operates without proper consent forfeits all claims to extracted minerals. If they've already been surveying and taking samples, they're in violation of territorial law." The implications were staggering. Not only could Cedar Ridge resist the forced relocation, but the community could potentially claim ownership of any minerals the corporation had already identified. The very greed that had driven the conspiracy could be turned against the conspirators. Sheriff Preston was examining the deed when riders approached the jail at a gallop. Through the window, they could see at least a dozen men on horseback, all wearing the kind of trail gear that marked them as professional gunmen rather than legitimate businessmen. The riders dismounted with military precision and began surrounding the building with obvious hostile intent. "More of Blackstone's people," Preston said grimly, checking his ammunition. "They're not here to negotiate." Jeremiah moved to the window and assessed their situation with tactical awareness honed by years of dangerous mining work. "Professional crew," he observed. "They know what they're doing, but they don't know the terrain. That gives us an advantage if we can get out of this building." "We can't leave," Rachel said firmly. "If we run now, they'll destroy the deed and kill Dr. Morrison before he can testify. We need to make our stand here, where the whole town can see what's happening." The leader of the hired gunmen approached the jail under a white flag, his confident bearing suggesting someone accustomed to intimidating local authorities. "Sheriff Preston," he called out, "I'm Captain Wade Morrison, representing the Mountain Development Corporation's Security Division. We're here to retrieve our associates and resolve this misunderstanding peacefully." "No misunderstanding here," Preston replied through the door. "Your associates are charged with attempted murder, conspiracy, and fraud. They'll be held for trial by territorial authorities." "I'm afraid that's not acceptable," Morrison replied smoothly. "We have jurisdiction in this matter under territorial mining law. You have 5 minutes to release our people and turn over any documents they were attempting to retrieve." Rachel stepped up beside Sheriff Preston, her voice carrying clearly through the door. "Captain Morrison, I'm Rachel Morgan, the woman your people tried to murder. I have something to say about your jurisdiction claims." She held up the deed of trust, where the gunman could see it through the window. "This document proves that Cedar Ridge holds collective ownership of all mineral rights in this area. Your Mountain Development Corporation has no legal standing here, and any surveying or sampling you've conducted constitutes theft under territorial law." The effect on the gunmen was immediate and telling. Several of them exchanged worried glances, and their captain's confident demeanor cracked slightly. "That document is fraudulent," he declared, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then you won't mind if we send it to the territorial capital for authentication," Rachel replied. Along with Dr. Morrison's confession about the attempted murder and the mining company's correspondence about land acquisition through violence, Jeremiah watched the gunmen's positioning with growing concern. "They're not planning to negotiate," he said quietly. "See how they're spreading out? They're getting ready to storm the building." "Let them come," Preston said, checking his rifle. This jail was built to withstand trouble, but Rachel was thinking beyond the immediate confrontation. "Jerry, you said you know these mountains better than anyone. Is there a way to get word to the territorial authorities without going through these men?" Jeremiah's eyes brightened with sudden inspiration. "The old mine telegraph line. It was never completely dismantled, just abandoned when the main office closed. If I can get to the mountain station, I might be able to signal the territorial marshal's office." "That's a mile of open ground between here and the mine," Preston observed. "You'd never make it past their pickets." "I know every trail, every hiding spot, every cave between here and there," Jeremiah replied with quiet confidence. 15 years of living like a ghost has some advantages." Rachel grasped his hand tightly. "It's too dangerous. If something happens to you, if something happens to me, you still have the deed and Dr. Morrison's testimony," Jeremiah interrupted gently. "But if we all die here, those documents die with us. Someone has to survive to tell this story." The sound of breaking glass from the rear of the building announced that the gunman had tired of negotiation. Preston cursed and moved to cover the back entrance, while Rachel and Jeremiah took positions near the front windows. Dr. Morrison, still locked in his cell, pressed himself against the far wall in terror. "Time to go," Jeremiah said, pressing a quick kiss to Rachel's forehead. "Keep that deed safe. And keep yourself safer." Before she could protest, he was gone, slipping out through a side window with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years moving unseen through dangerous territory. Rachel watched him disappear into the mountain shadows, carrying with him their only hope of bringing help before the hired gunmen overwhelmed their defenses. The deed of trust, hidden in the schoolhouse foundation, represented more than legal protection. It was proof that ordinary people could stand together against corporate power and win, if they had the courage to fight for what was right. As the first shots rang out and the battle for Cedar Ridge began in earnest, Rachel clutched that document to her chest and prayed that Jeremiah's intimate knowledge of the mountains would be enough to save them all. The moment that would shatter everything Rachel thought she knew about trust and betrayal came during what should have been Cedar Ridge's finest hour. As the hired gunmen pressed their attack on the jail, the townspeople had rallied to defend their community with a courage that would have made their founders proud. Men who had never fired a shot in anger took up hunting rifles, while women loaded ammunition and tended wounds with steady hands. The collective spirit that had sustained the town through decades of hardship was crystallizing into effective resistance. Sheriff Preston coordinated the defense from his office, his years of military experience evident in how he positioned the volunteer defenders to maximum advantage. Dr. Morrison, despite his guilt over the poisoning plot, had proven his redemption by treating wounded townspeople under fire, his medical skills invaluable as the battle intensified. Even the children contributed by carrying messages between defensive positions, their small size allowing them to move unseen through the chaos. Rachel had taken charge of protecting the crucial evidence that could save their community. the deed of trust, the mining company documents, and Dr. Morrison's written confession detailing the conspiracy. These papers represented Cedar Ridge's legal ammunition against corporate destruction, and she guarded them with fierce determination. While coordinating the civilian evacuation to safer positions, the tide of battle seemed to be turning in the townspeople's favor when Sheriff Preston made an announcement that stopped everyone in their tracks. Standing in the center of the jail's main room, he reached up and slowly removed his tin star, the symbol of authority he had worn proudly for over a decade. The metal badge caught the lamplight as he held it out toward Rachel with an expression of profound regret. "I'm sorry, Rachel," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of terrible confession. "I'm truly sorry for what I've had to do." The words hit her like a physical blow, but it was the implication behind them that made her blood turn to ice. "Wade," she whispered, using his first name for the first time in years. "What are you saying?" Preston's weathered face showed the strain of a man who had been living with unbearable secrets. "I've been feeding information to the Mountain Development Corporation for 8 months, he admitted, his voice barely audible over the sound of gunfire outside. "Every meeting, every plan, every defensive position, they've known about it all because I told them." The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Dr. Morrison stared at the sheriff in horror, while the townspeople who had trusted Preston with their lives struggled to comprehend the scope of his betrayal. Rachel felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet, her understanding of recent events crumbling as the true nature of their situation became clear. "The poison plot," she said, "pieces falling into horrible place." "You knew about it from the beginning." Preston nodded miserably. "They approached me last spring when my son needed surgery in Denver. The medical bills were more than I could ever afford on a sheriff's salary, and they offered to pay everything in exchange for information about potential resistance to their land acquisition plans." "So you sold out your own community," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the fury building inside her. "I thought it would just be information," Preston said desperately. "I never thought they would try to kill you. When Dr. Morrison told me about the poisoning plan, I tried to talk them out of it, but they said it was the only way to remove the legal obstacle you represented." The implications were staggering. Every defensive preparation they had made, every plan they had formed, had been compromised from the beginning. The hired gunmen outside weren't just attacking blindly. They knew exactly where the defenders were positioned because Preston had provided detailed intelligence about the town's layout and capabilities. Dr. Morrison found his voice first. "Wade, how could you? These people trusted you with their lives." "My son was dying," Preston replied, his composure finally cracking. "They showed me the medical reports, the costs of treatment, the specialists he would need. What was I supposed to do? Let my boy die to protect a few acres of mountain land?" "You were supposed to find another way," Rachel said firmly. "You were supposed to trust your community to help you the way we've always helped each other. Instead, you made a deal with people who were planning to destroy everything we've built here." The sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of Captain Morrison and several of his gunmen, who entered the jail with weapons drawn, but not immediately threatening. The captain's confident smile suggested a man who knew he held all the advantages. "Sheriff Preston," Morrison said formally, "thank you for your assistance in this matter. Your intelligence about the building's layout and the townspeople's defensive positions has been invaluable." Rachel watched in sick fascination as Preston handed over his badge to the corporate security chief, the symbol of legitimate authority, transferring to someone who represented nothing but greed and violence. The gesture was more than symbolic. It represented the corruption of everything the badge had once stood for. The deed of trust and other documents. "Please," Morrison continued, extending his hand toward Rachel with obvious expectation, but Rachel clutched the papers tighter, her mind racing as she considered their rapidly deteriorating situation. "Even if I give you these documents, you can't change what they prove." The territorial authorities will have copies of the original deed, and Dr. Morrison's confession has already been witnessed by dozens of people. Morrison's smile grew colder. I'm afraid you're mistaken about that, Miss Morgan. Dr. Morrison's confession will be attributed to the delusional ramblings of a man suffering from the same mental illness that has affected you. As for the deed, well, historical documents can be misinterpreted, especially by people who lack proper legal training. The plan was becoming clear in its vicious elegance. By discrediting both Rachel and Dr. Morrison as mentally unstable, the mining company could dismiss any testimony they might provide. The physical evidence could be destroyed or explained away, leaving no credible witnesses to challenge the corporate narrative. Preston spoke up with obvious reluctance. Captain, you promised that no one else would be hurt if I cooperated. These people have surrendered. There's no need for further violence. That was before they chose to resist, Morrison replied coldly. The situation has escalated beyond the point where we can afford to leave witnesses. Cedar Ridge will be remembered as a tragic mining accident, a gas explosion that claimed the entire population. These things happen in remote mountain communities. The true horror of their situation crystallized in that moment. The mining company hadn't just been planning to relocate the town. They had been planning to eliminate it entirely, murdering every resident and claiming the land through fraudulent documentation. Preston's betrayal had simply made their task easier by providing intelligence about the community's defenses and capabilities. Dr. Morrison made a sound of anguish as he realized the full scope of what he had helped set in motion. My God, Wade, what have we done? They're planning to kill everyone. Preston's face went ashen as the implications hit him. You said relocation, he whispered to Captain Morrison. You said the townspeople would be compensated and moved to new homes. I said whatever was necessary to secure your cooperation, Morrison replied with casual cruelty. Your son's medical bills have been paid, Sheriff. That was the extent of our agreement. The sheriff's badge that Preston had surrendered represented more than personal betrayal. It symbolized the corruption of justice itself, the moment when legitimate authority bowed to corporate power and abandoned the people it was sworn to protect. As Rachel watched Preston's horror at discovering the true cost of his collaboration, she understood that their fight was no longer just about saving Cedar Ridge. It was about proving that ordinary people could stand against evil, even when their own leaders had abandoned them. Outside, the battle continued. But now Rachel knew that every defensive position had been compromised, every plan had been anticipated, and their only hope lay with Jeremiah, somewhere in the mountains, racing against time to bring help before the mining company could complete their genocidal plan. High in the mountain peaks where the air was thin and the silence profound, Jeremiah Hawke moved through terrain that had been his home for 15 years, with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to read every shadow, every wind shift, every subtle sign that marked the difference between safety and death. Behind him lay the chaos of Cedar Ridge under siege. Ahead of him waited the abandoned mine complex, where rusted telegraph equipment might offer their only hope of summoning help. The journey that would have taken most men hours to complete on horseback, Jeremiah accomplished in 90 minutes on foot, using hidden game trails and forgotten mining paths that existed only in his memory and the memories of the indigenous peoples who had known these mountains long before copper fever brought white settlers to the territory. Every step was calculated, every movement designed to avoid the corporate security teams that he knew would be patrolling the main approaches to the mining complex. The dynamite cache that would change everything lay hidden in a natural cave system that Jeremiah had discovered during his second year as a hermit. The explosives dated from his time as mine foreman, carefully preserved and maintained against the possibility that they might someday be needed for legitimate mining purposes. Over the years, he had relocated them from their original storage site to this more secure location, driven by the paranoid caution that had kept him alive in a hostile wilderness. The wooden boxes bore the faded markings of the Mountain View Mining Company, ironic reminders of the corporation that had destroyed his life and was now threatening to destroy his community. Inside each box, wrapped in oiled cloth and protected from moisture, lay enough blasting powder and fused charges to bring down half a mountain or to collapse the mine tunnels that the new mining company planned to use for their operations. Jeremiah's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he prepared the charges, his muscle memory overriding the tremor that had plagued his fingers since the original mine explosion. The work brought back memories of better times, when he had been respected for his expertise and trusted with the lives of working men who depended on his knowledge to keep them safe. Now that same expertise would be turned against the forces that threatened everything he had come to love. The telegraph station occupied a wooden building that had been abandoned when the Mountain View Mining Company ceased operations 5 years earlier. Most of the equipment had been removed or vandalized, but Jeremiah's trained eye spotted the components that might still function if properly reconnected. The main transmission line ran down the mountain toward the territorial capital, following a route that would be difficult for the corporate security teams to locate and cut. Working by lamplight, Jeremiah began the delicate process of restoring power to the telegraph system. His knowledge of electrical systems came from his mining days, when he had supervised the installation of communication equipment in the deeper tunnels. The work required patience and precision, two qualities that his years of isolation had helped him develop, but also speed, because he knew that every minute of delay increased the danger to Rachel and the other townspeople. Back in Cedar Ridge, the situation had deteriorated beyond anything the residents could have imagined when they first rallied to defend their community. Captain Morrison's revelation about Sheriff Preston's betrayal had shattered the townspeople's confidence in their defensive preparations. While the mining company's true intentions, genocide disguised as a mining accident, had transformed their struggle from a property dispute into a fight for survival, Rachel had taken command of the civilian evacuation with the same organizational skills that had made her such an effective teacher. Working with Dr. Morrison, who was desperately trying to atone for his role in the conspiracy, she coordinated the movement of families to the most defensible positions while ensuring that the crucial legal documents remained protected. Her calm authority in the face of overwhelming danger inspired the townspeople to maintain their resistance despite the odds against them. The church basement served as both field hospital and command center, its stone construction providing better protection than most buildings in town. Dr. Morrison worked tirelessly to treat the wounded, his medical skills proving invaluable as the corporate gunmen intensified their assault. His redemption was measured not in words, but in actions. The steady hands that cleaned wounds, the gentle voice that comforted frightened children, the courage he showed in exposing himself to danger to reach injured defenders. Sheriff Preston's internal struggle became more apparent as the true nature of the mining company's plans unfolded. His betrayal had been motivated by desperation rather than greed, a father's willingness to sacrifice his principles to save his son's life. But now, faced with the reality that his cooperation had enabled mass murder, he found himself caught between loyalty to his son and loyalty to the community he had sworn to protect. "I have to stop this," he told Rachel during a brief lull in the fighting. "I know their plans, their positions, their timing. Maybe you can help us survive long enough for Jerry to bring help," Rachel interrupted. "That's the only redemption available to you now, Wade. Help us hold out until the territorial authorities arrive." The tactical planning that followed drew on Preston's military experience and his detailed knowledge of the corporate security team's capabilities. He provided crucial intelligence about their weapons, their numbers, and their intended assault routes, information that allowed the townspeople to maximize their defensive advantages. It was a small step toward redemption, but an important one. Dr. Morrison's courage manifested in his willingness to venture into the most dangerous areas of town to treat wounded defenders. His medical bag, which had once carried poison intended for Rachel's murder, now carried bandages and morphine that saved lives. When young Timothy Brooks was shot while carrying ammunition to the church defenders, Dr. Morrison crawled through 50 yards of open ground under fire to reach him and provide emergency treatment. The transformation of ordinary citizens into determined fighters would have been remarkable under any circumstances, but it was particularly moving given the betrayals they had suffered. Farmers who had never imagined pointing weapons at other human beings found themselves picking off corporate gunmen with hunting rifles. Shopkeepers who had spent their lives serving customers discovered reserves of courage that enabled them to stand firm under fire. Mothers who had devoted themselves to nurturing life prepared to fight to the death to protect their children. High in the mountains, Jeremiah finally succeeded in establishing telegraph contact with the territorial marshal's office. The ancient equipment crackled and sparked as he tapped out his message in the Morse code he had learned during his mining days, when communication with the outside world had been essential for coordinating ore shipments and supply deliveries. The response came back with agonizing slowness. Each letter transmitted across hundreds of miles of mountain wilderness. Marshal unavailable, stop assistant, deputy investigates, stop arrive, Cedar Ridge, tomorrow stop. Tomorrow would be too late. Jeremiah understood that the corporate gunmen would complete their massacre long before any official help could arrive. The territorial authorities operated on bureaucratic schedules that bore no relationship to the urgent realities of life and death in remote mountain communities, but the telegraph contact had served another purpose. It had created an official record of the crisis in Cedar Ridge. Even if the mining company succeeded in killing all the witnesses, their crimes would not go unnoticed or uninvestigated. The territorial authorities would eventually uncover the truth, and justice would be served, even if it came too late to save the people Jeremiah cared about. Most Jeremiah's final preparations took on the character of a military operation planned by someone who understood both the terrain and the enemy's capabilities. The dynamite charges were positioned with mathematical precision, designed to create maximum disruption to the mining company's operations while minimizing harm to the townspeople. The fuses were timed to allow him to reach safety, but also to coordinate with what he hoped would be the defender's final stand. As he made his way back down the mountain towards Cedar Ridge, carrying enough explosive power to change the course of the battle, Jeremiah reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. 15 years earlier, he had been a respected member of the community, trusted and valued for his expertise. The mine explosion had transformed him into an outcast, a figure of fear and pity who lived on the margins of society. Now, in what might be the final hours of his life, he was returning to that same community as their potential savior. The warning bell that would signal the beginning of the final confrontation was a relic from the original mine, a massive bronze instrument that could be heard for miles in the thin mountain air. Jeremiah had positioned it at a strategic point where its sound would carry to both the town and the mining complex, serving as a call to action for anyone willing to stand against corporate tyranny. As he prepared to ring that bell and initiate the last desperate gamble that might save Cedar Ridge, Jeremiah thought about Rachel and the love that had grown between them despite the impossible circumstances of their reunion. Whether they lived or died in the coming battle, their connection had given him something precious that he had thought lost forever, the sense that his life had meaning beyond mere survival, that he was part of something larger and more important than his own pain and isolation. The deep bronze voice of the warning bell echoed across the valley like thunder rolling down from the peaks, its resonant call to action carrying across miles of mountain wilderness to reach every ear in Cedar Ridge. Jeremiah's powerful arms swung the massive clapper with rhythmic precision, each strike of metal against metal sending vibrations through the ground that could be felt as well as heard. The ancient mine bell, silent for 5 years since the Mountain View Mining Company's closure, had found its voice again at the moment when everything hung in the balance. The sound galvanized the townspeople into coordinated action with an efficiency that would have been impossible without their weeks of desperate preparation. Rachel felt her heart leap as the bell's call reached the church basement, where she had been coordinating the civilian evacuation. The signal meant that Jeremiah was alive, that his dangerous mission to the mountain telegraph station had succeeded, and that their final gambit was about to begin. "That's Jerry's signal," she announced to the defenders gathered in the basement. "Everyone to your positions. This is our chance to end this fight on our terms." The mining company forces had been systematically tightening their siege of the town, using their superior numbers and firepower to gradually eliminate the townspeople's defensive positions. Captain Morrison's tactical expertise, combined with Sheriff Preston's detailed intelligence about local capabilities, had given the corporate gunmen significant advantages in the urban warfare that had consumed Cedar Ridge for the past 6 hours. But Jeremiah's intimate knowledge of the mountain terrain represented a strategic asset that the corporate forces had failed to account for. 15 years of living like a ghost in the wilderness had taught him every hidden approach, every concealed position, every natural advantage that could be exploited by someone willing to take desperate risks. His first strike came without warning. A carefully placed explosive charge that collapsed the corporate force's main ammunition depot in a thunderous blast that shook windows throughout the valley. The depot had been established in what the gunman thought was a secure location, but Jeremiah's knowledge of the old mining tunnels had allowed him to approach unseen and plant his charges with devastating precision. The explosion sent the corporate gunmen scrambling for cover while simultaneously announcing to the townspeople that their tormentor was no longer an untouchable force. Jeremiah followed up his initial success with a series of hit-and-run attacks that utilized the mountain's natural features to maximum advantage, appearing like a vengeful spirit to strike at isolated enemy positions before vanishing back into the landscape he knew better than any living man. Rachel led a coordinated group of townspeople in a diversionary assault on the corporate force's eastern flank, drawing their attention away from Jeremiah's more critical operations while demonstrating that the defenders were far from beaten. Her group consisted mostly of women and older men who lacked the physical strength for direct combat but possessed the determination and intelligence necessary for tactical maneuvering. Dr. Morrison's courage in the face of mortal danger proved to be one of the day's most inspiring developments. Despite his guilt over his role in the poisoning conspiracy, he repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to provide medical treatment to wounded defenders. His medical bag, which had once carried poison intended for Rachel's murder, now carried bandages and morphine that saved lives and enabled injured fighters to continue their resistance. The doctor's redemption reached its climax when he made a crucial decision that demonstrated his complete break with the corporate conspiracy. Captain Morrison had been using Dr. Morrison's medical expertise to treat wounded corporate gunmen, expecting professional obligation to override personal loyalty. But when the doctor was presented with a choice between saving a wounded corporate soldier and rushing to treat young Timothy Brooks, who had been shot while carrying ammunition to the defenders, his decision was immediate and final. "I'm done treating your killers," Dr. Morrison told Captain Morrison bluntly. "My oath is to preserve life, not to enable murder." The doctor's defection cost the corporate forces their only source of medical treatment, while simultaneously providing the townspeople with expert care for their wounded. More importantly, it demonstrated that redemption was possible even for those who had made terrible choices, inspiring other wavering individuals to choose the right side before it was too late. Sheriff Preston's moment of truth came when Captain Morrison ordered him to lead a squad of gunmen in an assault on the church basement where the civilian families had taken shelter. The corporate security chief's plan was brutally simple: eliminate the non-combatants to break the townspeople's will to resist, using Preston's knowledge of the building's layout to ensure maximum casualties. "I can't do that," Preston said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of his refusal. "I won't be responsible for murdering children. You've been responsible for everything that's happened here," Captain Morrison replied coldly. "Your intelligence enabled this entire operation. The blood is already on your hands. A little more won't make any difference." But Preston's decision had already been made during the terrible hours when he watched the consequences of his betrayal unfold. The sheriff's badge that he had surrendered in shame became a symbol of something different when he picked it up from Captain Morrison's belt and pinned it back on his chest with deliberate ceremony. "I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder," Preston told the corporate security chief. "You have the right to surrender peacefully, or you can resist and face the consequences." The confrontation that followed was brief but decisive. Captain Morrison's reach for his sidearm was met by Preston's faster draw, the result of decades of experience in dangerous situations. The corporate security chief fell with a bullet through his shoulder, his command structure disrupted at the crucial moment when coordination was most essential. Jeremiah's tactical brilliance became evident as his various operations converged into a unified assault that exploited every advantage the mountain environment could provide. His knowledge of underground passages allowed him to appear behind enemy lines when they least expected it, while his understanding of local weather patterns enabled him to use sudden wind shifts and moving shadows to mask his movements. The corporate gunmen, despite their professional training and superior equipment, found themselves fighting an enemy who seemed to anticipate their every move. Jeremiah's explosives eliminated their heavy weapons positions. His marksmanship from concealed locations picked off their leaders, and his psychological warfare tactics, appearing and disappearing like a mountain spirit, gradually eroded their confidence and cohesion. As the sun began to set over Cedar Ridge, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reflected the fires burning throughout the town, the balance of power had shifted decisively in favor of the defenders. The corporate forces, reduced to less than half their original strength and demoralized by the loss of their leadership, began to recognize that their mission had failed. The warning bell's bronze voice had announced more than the beginning of a battle. It had proclaimed the determination of ordinary people to defend their home against overwhelming odds, and their willingness to pay any price necessary to preserve the community they loved. The final confrontation at the mine entrance unfolded like a scene from the old stories that grandfathers told around winter fires, a battle between good and evil that would determine the fate of an entire community. Jeremiah had positioned his final charges with the precision of a master craftsman, understanding that this last gambit would either save Cedar Ridge or destroy any chance of stopping the corporate conspiracy. The mine entrance itself was a gaping wound in the mountainside, reinforced with timber and steel that spoke of the industrial ambitions that had first brought white settlers to this remote valley. The tunnels beyond the entrance stretched deep into the earth, following copper veins that had been mapped and claimed by the Mountain Development Corporation as the foundation of their genocidal land. Grabbed Jeremiah's use of explosives to collapse the mining tunnels was more than a tactical decision. It was a symbolic act of defiance that would make the corporate claims worthless, even if the townspeople were eventually defeated. Without access to the underground mineral deposits, the mining company's investment in murder and conspiracy would yield nothing but massive financial losses and criminal liability. The charges detonated in sequence, each explosion sending tremors through the mountain that could be felt for miles around. The carefully placed dynamite brought down thousands of tons of rock and timber, sealing the tunnels permanently and creating a geological barrier that would take years and millions of dollars to overcome. The sound was like the mountain itself, crying out in protest against those who would rape it for profit. Rachel's successful. Contact with federal authorities came through the restored telegraph line that Jeremiah had risked his life to repair. Her message, transmitted in clear language that left no room for misinterpretation, reached the territorial marshal's office just as news of the corporate conspiracy was beginning to spread through official channels in the capital. The federal response was swift and decisive, driven by political pressure from territorial officials who understood that corporate violence against entire communities threatened the stability of civilian government throughout the region. A company of territorial militia was dispatched immediately, with orders to restore law and order in Cedar Ridge and to arrest anyone involved in the conspiracy regardless of their corporate affiliations or political connections. Sheriff Preston's sacrifice to protect the townspeople represented the completion of his personal redemption arc, transforming him from betrayer to hero in a matter of hours. When the remaining corporate gunmen made their final desperate assault on the church basement, where the civilian families had taken shelter, Preston positioned himself in the doorway and held them off single-handedly until reinforcements could arrive. The sheriff's final stand was witnessed by the children he had sworn to protect, their young eyes recording images of courage that would inspire them for the rest of their lives. Preston fell with multiple wounds, but his sacrifice bought enough time for Jeremiah and the other defenders to eliminate the remaining corporate forces and secure the safety of the non-combatants. Dr. Morrison's key role in exposing the poison plot extended beyond his medical testimony to include detailed documentation of the corporate conspiracy's scope and methods. His written confession, combined with the physical evidence of the poison bottles and the mining company documents, provided federal authorities with everything they needed to pursue criminal charges against the mountain development. Corporation's leadership. The doctor's expertise in toxicology also proved crucial in treating other townspeople who had been experiencing mysterious illnesses similar to Rachel's symptoms. His investigation revealed that the corporate conspirators had been conducting a gradual poisoning campaign against several key community leaders, using Dr. Morrison's trusted position to administer doses of plant-based toxins that would have eventually eliminated all organized resistance to their land grab. The mining company's defeat and retreat came not through military victory, but through the collapse of their entire operational strategy. The destruction of the mine tunnels eliminated their primary asset, while the exposure of their criminal conspiracy triggered federal investigations that froze their corporate assets and led to arrest warrants for their leadership. Captain Morrison and his surviving gunmen attempted to flee the territory, but territorial militia units intercepted them at mountain passes that Jeremiah had identified as their most likely escape routes. The corporate security chief's capture provided federal authorities with detailed intelligence about the conspiracy's financing and organization, leading to additional arrests and prosecutions. Throughout the region, Jeremiah's emergence as a town hero represented more than personal vindication. It symbolized the triumph of local knowledge and community, solidarity over corporate power and outside exploitation. The man who had been dismissed as a madman for 15 years was suddenly recognized as the tactical genius whose expertise had saved an entire community from destruction. Rachel's public declaration of her feelings for Jeremiah came during the community celebration that followed their victory, her words carrying across the assembled crowd with the clarity of a church bell calling people to worship. Standing beside the man who had saved her life twice, she spoke of love that had grown from shared struggle and mutual respect, a bond forged in the crucible of mortal danger. The community celebration of their victory lasted 3 days, with families sharing food and stories that would become part of Cedar Ridge's permanent folklore. The children who had witnessed the battle would grow up knowing that ordinary people could defeat seemingly impossible odds when they stood together and refused to surrender their principles. The legal victory that secured the town's mineral rights came through the deed of trust that Rachel had discovered, but it was reinforced by federal legislation that protected rural communities from corporate exploitation. The Mountain Development Corporation's attempted genocide had triggered political reforms that would prevent similar conspiracies throughout the American West. The schoolhouse bell that Rachel rang to call her scattered townspeople home after their victory carried a message of hope that resonated far beyond Cedar Ridge itself. The clear bronze tone announced that communities could resist corporate tyranny, that justice could prevail over greed, and that love could flourish even in the aftermath of terrible betrayal and violence. 6 months after the siege that nearly destroyed Cedar Ridge, the morning sun cast the same golden light across the valley. But everything else had changed in ways that spoke to the resilience of communities that refused to surrender their dreams. The scars of battle remained visible in repaired buildings and freshly turned earth where new foundations had been laid. But these marks served as reminders of victory rather than symbols of defeat. Rachel stood at the window of her expanded schoolhouse, watching children play in the yard where corporate gunmen had once positioned themselves for assault. The new classroom wing had been built with lumber donated by families throughout the territory, their contributions representing a regional commitment to education and community values that transcended local boundaries. Her student enrollment had doubled as families moved to Cedar Ridge, specifically because of its reputation as a place where ordinary people had stood against impossible odds and won. The transformation of Jeremiah from outcast to community leader had been gradual but profound. His integration into town life facilitated by neighbors who finally understood the depth of his knowledge and the strength of his character. His appointment as Cedar Ridge's new mine safety inspector was both practical and symbolic. Practical because his expertise could prevent future disasters. Symbolic because it represented the community's determination to put human welfare ahead of corporate profits. The expanded school served families from 3 neighboring valleys. Its reputation for excellence, drawing students whose parents were willing to travel considerable distances to ensure their children received education from teachers who had proven their courage under fire. Rachel's classroom had become a model for rural education throughout the territory, with visiting educators coming to observe her methods and learn from her experience. Dr. Morrison's practice had been restored not through forgiveness but through demonstrated commitment to the healing arts that had originally called him to medicine. His treatment of wounded defenders during the siege had proven his redemption more convincingly than any words could have done, and his ongoing research into plant-based toxins had led to medical discoveries that benefited communities throughout the region. The doctor's written protocols for identifying and treating poisoning cases had been distributed to medical practitioners across the territory, potentially saving lives in communities that might face similar corporate conspiracies. His testimony before territorial authorities had also led to legislation requiring medical professionals to report suspected poisoning cases to law enforcement, creating safeguards against the kind of conspiracy that had nearly claimed Rachel's life. Sheriff Preston's memory was honored not despite his betrayal, but because of his ultimate choice to stand with his community when everything was on the line. His grave in the Cedar Ridge Cemetery bore an inscription that captured the complexity of human nature. A man who lost his way but found his courage when it mattered most. The memorial served as a reminder that redemption was always possible for those willing to pay its price. The environmental protection of the mountain had been secured through territorial legislation that designated the area around Cedar Ridge as protected watershed, preventing future mining operations while preserving the natural beauty that had originally drawn settlers to the valley. The collapsed mine tunnels served as a permanent barrier against corporate exploitation, their destruction having created geological conditions that made large-scale mining impossible. Jeremiah and Rachel's wedding preparations had become a community project that reflected the collective spirit that had enabled their victory against corporate tyranny. Every family contributed something to the celebration: food, music, decorations, or simply their presence as witnesses to a love that had grown from shared struggle and mutual respect. The simple gold wedding rings that Jeremiah crafted from mountain gold represented more than personal commitment. They symbolized the transformation from isolation to belonging that had changed both their lives. The gold itself came from streams that Jeremiah had discovered during his years of solitude, metal that he had refined using techniques learned during his mining days, now fashioned into symbols of hope and continuity. Jeremiah's speech at their wedding ceremony would be remembered for generations as an articulation of values that defined Cedar Ridge's character. Standing before the assembled community, the man who had once been considered mad spoke with eloquence about finding family after years of isolation, about the courage required to trust others after betrayal, and about the responsibility that came with being accepted back into the human community. 15 years ago, I thought my life was over, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd gathered in the shadow of the mountains. I believed that the explosion that took my friends and my sanity had also taken my future. But I learned something in these mountains that I want to share with all of you. Sometimes what seems like an ending is really just a beginning in disguise. Rachel's reflection on how near death had led to true life provided the wedding's most moving moment. Her words capturing the paradox of finding love through facing mortality together. Jerry saved my life twice, she said, looking at her husband with eyes that held no secrets. Once when he stopped my burial, and again when he showed me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the willingness to act despite fear when people you love are in danger. The community celebration of their resilience extended far beyond the wedding ceremony to encompass festivals and traditions that would be passed down to future generations. The annual Resistance Day celebration commemorated not just their military victory, but their moral triumph over corporate greed and governmental corruption. Children throughout the territory learned songs and stories about the siege of Cedar Ridge, tales that emphasized the power of ordinary people to achieve extraordinary things when they stood together. These stories served educational purposes beyond entertainment, teaching young people about civic responsibility and the importance of questioning authority when it served corrupt ends. The establishment of new town traditions that honored their survival included the ringing of the schoolhouse bell every morning at dawn, a daily reminder of the call to community that had saved them. The bell's bronze voice carried the same message each day, that isolation was a choice, that belonging required courage, and that freedom was something that had to be earned and defended by each generation. The final scene of their story unfolded on a crisp autumn morning when Jeremiah stood before a group of children, teaching them about mountain safety and the signs that warned of natural dangers. His students listened with the rapt attention that children reserve for adults who have proven themselves worthy of respect, their young minds absorbing lessons that went far beyond geology and survival skills. Rachel watched from the schoolhouse steps as her husband shared his knowledge with the next generation, his scarred hands pointing out rock formations and weather patterns that could mean the difference between life and death in mountain country. The man who had once been broken by trauma and isolation had found his purpose in protecting others from the dangers he had survived. As the children headed home with new knowledge and renewed respect for the mountains that surrounded their community, Rachel reflected on the strange turns that life could take. Her near burial had led to discoveries about love, courage, and community that she never could have imagined during her years as a simple schoolteacher. The conspiracy that had been designed to destroy her had instead transformed her into something stronger and more Complete, the wedding rings on their fingers caught the afternoon. Sunlight as Jeremiah and Rachel walked hand in hand toward their home, their steps marking the rhythm of a life built on shared values and mutual devotion. Behind them, the mountains stood as eternal witnesses to the truth that love could flourish even in the aftermath of betrayal, and that communities united by common purpose could overcome any challenge that greed and corruption might devise. Cedar Ridge had become more than a town. It was a symbol of hope for anyone who believed that ordinary people, armed with courage and determination, could stand against the forces that would exploit and destroy everything decent in the world. The story that had begun with a funeral had become a celebration of life, love, and the enduring power of human community to triumph over evil.